The street musician shares half his earnings with homeless, unaware a record producer was listening nearby. The simple act, quarters and crumpled bills divided on a cold sidewalk, would alter the trajectory of two broken lives forever. Mason Matthews' fingers ached from the December chill. 3 hours of playing his weathered guitar on this Chicago street corner had yielded exactly $27.43. Not enough for both rent and dinner, but more than he'd made yesterday. The wind whipped through his thin jacket, finding every seam and stitch that had worn thin over the past 2 years. He didn't look like someone who had once played to sold-out venues. Not anymore. The fine lines around his eyes had deepened into crevices. His once pristine guitar bore scratches and stains that told the story of his fall from grace. 3 years ago, he'd been on the verge of breakthrough success. Now at 34, he was just another street performer, invisible to the hurried masses rushing past. His final song of the evening, an original he'd written in better days, drifted into the twilight air, notes spiraling upward like prayers. As the last chord faded, Mason noticed him. The same homeless man who had been huddled against the building wall for the past week. Gaunt face, eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the world. A cardboard sign with faded letters, "Anything helps." Something about the man's stillness amid the city's chaos struck Mason. He'd seen him before, of course, but tonight, perhaps it was the particular quality of desperation in the man's hunched shoulders. Or maybe it was the way he cradled a small, worn photograph, like it was the last precious thing in his world. Mason counted his earnings again. $27.43. Not even enough to cover the past due notice on his apartment door. His stomach growled in protest. Bad night? The homeless man's voice was surprisingly gentle, cultured even. It startled Mason. "I've had worse," Mason replied, though he couldn't immediately recall when. The man nodded, a silent acknowledgement of shared struggle. His eyes briefly met Mason's, clear brown eyes that didn't match the rest of his weathered appearance. Mason's fingers closed around the money in his palm. He'd earned every cent through frozen fingers and ignored pleas for attention. This money was his survival, his next meal, part of next month's rent. And yet, without fully understanding why, Mason crossed the short distance between them. He knelt down, his knees cracking in protest, and began dividing the small pile of money into two roughly equal portions. "What is your reach, sir? What are you doing?" The man's eyes widened. "I'm not sure," Mason admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. "Something stupid, probably." He held out $13.71. "It's not much." The man didn't move to take it. "Why?" Mason shrugged. "Maybe because we're both invisible to them." He nodded toward the stream of pedestrians. "But I can see you." Slowly, as if expecting Mason to snatch the money back, the man reached out. His fingers trembled. From cold or emotion, Mason couldn't tell. "My name is Daniel," he said quietly, as if offering something more valuable than Mason's money. "Mason." He shifted his weight, suddenly awkward. "Look, there's a diner around the corner. Cheap food, but it's warm. What do you say we make this stretch for both of us?" Daniel's hesitation was brief but noticeable. Trust didn't come easily on the streets. "I'd like that," he finally said. Neither man noticed the woman who had stopped several yards away, who had been listening to Mason's music for the past half hour. She wore an expensive coat and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. Sophia Winters had come to this part of town to clear her head after another disappointing studio session with another soulless musician with technical skill but no heart. What she had heard from Mason and what she had just witnessed made her pause her hurried journey back to her downtown office. With careful, deliberate movements, she pulled out her phone and made a note of the street corner, the time, and a brief description of the musician with the weathered guitar and unexpected generosity. The diner's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over Mason and Daniel's faces as they settled into a booth with cracked vinyl seats. Steam rose from chipped mugs of coffee, a luxury Daniel hadn't enjoyed in weeks. "You didn't have to do this," Daniel said, his hands wrapped around the mug, absorbing its warmth. Mason stirred sugar into his coffee. "Neither did you." "Do what?" "Listen. Every day this week, you've been the only one who actually listened to my music." Daniel's lips curved into a small smile. "I was a piano teacher. Before ... He gestured vaguely at himself, at the circumstances that had brought him to the streets. "What happened?" Mason asked, then immediately regretted it. "Sorry, none of my business." "It's okay." Daniel took a sip of coffee, closing his eyes briefly at the simple pleasure. "My daughter got sick. Cancer. Insurance covered some, but not enough. I sold everything, house, car, even my piano. After she ... his voice cracked. After I lost her, there wasn't anything left. Of my things. Of me. The photograph. Mason suddenly understood what Daniel had been holding. I'm sorry, he said, the words inadequate but sincere. Your music reminds me of what I used to play for her. Daniel's eyes were distant. She loved music, said it made the hospital less scary. Their food arrived, simple hamburgers and fries that represented a feast to both men. They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Two strangers connected by hardship and an unexpected moment of humanity. What's your story? Daniel finally asked. You're too good to be playing street corners. Mason's laugh held no humor. I had a record deal once. Small label, but it was something. Then I made the mistake of falling in love with the wrong person. He pushed a fry through a puddle of ketchup. She was the producer's daughter. When it ended badly, so did my career. That seems unfair. Life usually is. Mason shrugged. I burned bridges, developed a reputation, started drinking too much. The usual cliches. And now, 2 years sober. Mason held up his coffee cup in a mock toast. Playing wherever I can, trying to remember why I love music in the first place. As they finished their meal, Mason noticed Daniel's cough, a deep, rattling sound that spoke of nights spent in the cold. Where are you staying tonight? Mason asked. Daniel's expression closed slightly. There's a shelter on Adams Street. It's full. It's always full this time of year. Mason made a decision that surprised even himself. I have a couch. It's in an apartment that's barely bigger than this booth, but it's warm. Daniel stared at him. You don't know me. I know enough. Mason left money for the tip, cutting further into his half of the earnings. And I've been close enough to where you are to know that sometimes all it takes is one person giving a damn. That night in Mason's tiny apartment, with its water-stained ceiling and radiator that clanked like a percussion section, Daniel slept on a worn couch beneath Mason's only spare blanket. And for the first time in months, both men slept soundly. One because he was finally warm, the other because he had remembered what it felt like to be human. Morning brought weak sunlight and the realization that Mason had exactly $9.72 to his name. Not enough for rent, barely enough for food, and now he had 2 mouths to feed. I can't stay, Daniel said immediately upon waking, as if reading Mason's thoughts. You've done enough. Mason was already making coffee, the cheap kind that came in a plastic container. One more day won't hurt. Besides, you need to see a doctor for that cough. With what insurance? There's a free clinic 6 blocks from here. Mason poured the coffee into mismatched mugs. I've used it before. Daniel accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. Why are you doing all this? Mason leaned against the counter of his kitchenette. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe I'm storing up karma. Maybe I just recognize someone else who's drowning. He smiled slightly. Or maybe I'm just sick of being alone with my failures. They spent the morning at the free clinic, where Daniel was diagnosed with bronchitis and given antibiotics he couldn't have afforded on his own. Afterward, Mason brought him back to the apartment. You need to rest, Mason insisted. I'm going to play for a few hours. With any luck, I'll come back with enough for some decent food. Daniel watched him gather his guitar. Your music, he said quietly. The original songs. They're special. You should be recording them, not playing them to indifferent crowds. Mason paused, something in Daniel's sincerity touching a place he'd tried to keep closed. Thanks. That means something, coming from someone who understands music. He spent the afternoon at his usual corner, playing with renewed purpose. The cold seemed less biting today, the passers-by less indifferent. Or perhaps it was just his perspective that had shifted. His guitar case accumulated coins and bills. Not a fortune, but enough to feel like progress. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, Mason noticed her, the woman in the expensive coat who had stopped to listen yesterday. Today she wasn't alone. A man in a tailored suit stood beside her, his attention focused entirely on Mason's performance. When Mason finished his set, the woman approached, her companion following a step behind. You're very talented, she said without preamble. I'm Sophia Winters. This is my colleague, James Reynolds. Mason nodded, wary of compliments from strangers. Thanks for listening. We'd like to talk to you about your music, she continued. Do you have a few minutes? I charge by the hour. Mason joked reflexively, immediately regretting the defense mechanism. To his surprise, Sophia smiled. Fair enough. How about we discuss it over dinner? Our treat. Mason hesitated. I need to check on someone first. Something in Sophia's expression softened. The man you shared your earnings with yesterday? Mason's surprise must have shown on his face. "I was here," she explained. "I saw what you did. He's staying with me for a few days. He's sick." Sophia exchanged a glance with her colleague. "Bring him along, if he's feeling up to it." An hour later, Mason found himself in a restaurant he couldn't have afforded in his better days. Daniel beside him looking both uncomfortable and amazed at their surroundings. Across from them, Sophia Winters explained that she was an executive producer at Horizon Records, a boutique label known for finding unique talent. "I've been disappointed lately," she admitted, swirling wine in her glass. "Too many technically perfect musicians with nothing to say. No soul, no story." Her gaze settled on Mason. "Then I heard you. Raw, imperfect, but authentic. And then I saw you share what little you had with a stranger." Mason shifted uncomfortably. "What does one have to do with the other?" "Everything." James interjected. "The music industry is full of talented people who would step over their own mothers for a chance at success. Character is rare. Talent with character, even rarer. We'd like to offer you a recording opportunity," Sophia said. "Not a full contract yet, but a chance to record some of your original work in a proper studio. To see where it leads." Mason's heart pounded so loudly he was certain everyone at the table could hear it. "Why? Why now? Why me?" "Because your music made me stop walking," Sophia said simply. "In a city where everyone is always rushing somewhere else, your songs made me want to stay right where I was." As the reality of the opportunity sank in, Mason felt Daniel's hand briefly touch his arm, a silent congratulation, an acknowledgement of deserved fortune. "There's something else," Mason said, making a decision. "Daniel here, he was a piano teacher. He has an ear for music that I've rarely encountered." Daniel looked at him in confusion. "If I do this," Mason continued, meeting Sophia's evaluating gaze, "I want him involved. As a consultant, an advisor, whatever you want to call it, his input would be valuable." Sophia studied Daniel with new interest. "Is that true? You have a background in music?" Daniel cleared his throat. "I taught for 20 years. Before circumstances changed." James leaned forward. "We've been looking for someone with teaching experience to work with some of our younger artists. Perhaps we could discuss that as well." The meal continued, conversation flowing more easily as shock gave way to cautious hope. By dessert, preliminary agreements had been outlined. Mason would record 5 songs as a trial. Daniel would receive a consulting fee for his input and be considered for a position working with the label's developing artists. Walking back to Mason's apartment that night, Daniel was quiet. "You didn't have to do that," he finally said. "Include me." Mason looked up at the night sky, barely visible between tall buildings. "You know what's funny? For the first time in years, I'm doing exactly what I have to do. What feels right." In the weeks that followed, both men's lives transformed at a pace that seemed unreal. Mason recorded his songs in Horizon Studio, his raw talent refined but not diminished by professional production. Daniel's health improved, and his musical knowledge proved invaluable not just to Mason, but to several other artists at the label. Sophia, impressed by both men's contributions, offered them more permanent arrangements. Mason received a modest but genuine recording contract. Daniel was hired to work with the label's artist development program. With their first advance payments, they found a 2-bedroom apartment, a far cry from Mason's former cramped space. On moving day, Daniel carefully placed a framed photograph on his nightstand, a smiling young girl seated at a piano. Her name was Lily, he told Mason, the first time he'd spoken his daughter's name aloud in months. She would have loved your music. Mason nodded, understanding the magnitude of this shared confidence. Then I'll play for her too. 6 months after that fateful evening, when Mason had divided his meager earnings, his first single was released. The song, titled Half of Everything, told the story of finding wholeness by giving away what little you have. It climbed the independent charts steadily, its honest lyrics and soulful delivery resonating with listeners tired of manufactured pop. Daniel thrived in his new role, his natural teaching abilities helping young musicians find their authentic voices. The hollow look that had haunted his eyes gradually faded, replaced by purpose and, increasingly, moments of genuine joy. On the anniversary of their chance meeting, Mason insisted on taking Daniel back to the same street corner where it had all begun. The December air was just as cold, the pedestrians just as hurried. "Why are we here?" Daniel asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Mason removed his guitar from its case, a new case now, but the same weathered instrument. "To remember, and to give back." He began to play, his voice stronger now, but carrying the same emotional honesty that had first caught Sophia's attention. A few people slowed their pace. Some stopped entirely. When he finished his impromptu performance, Mason laid his open guitar case on the sidewalk and placed into it the first dollar bill. Daniel, understanding immediately, added another. They stepped back, watching as passers-by began adding their own contributions. By sunset, the case contained over $300. Mason gathered it all and walked directly to the nearby homeless shelter, Daniel at his side. For hot meals, Mason told a surprise volunteer at the desk, and maybe some music lessons if anyone's interested. Later that evening, in their warm apartment with its view of the city that had once seemed so indifferent to their existence, Daniel raised a glass in toast. To having everything, he said, and somehow ending up with more. Mason clinked his glass against Daniel's. To invisible men being seen, and to record producers who listen, Daniel added with a smile. Outside their window, snow began to fall, covering the harsh edges of the city with a soft, forgiving blanket of white. Inside, two men who had once been strangers, now family of choice, continued planning their next album, their next outreach program, their next steps forward in lives that had been transformed by a simple act of sharing. The street musician had shared half his earnings with the homeless, unaware a record producer was listening nearby. But perhaps the real miracle wasn't in who had been listening, but in the fact that he had chosen to share it all. A choice that had opened the door to healing, to purpose, and to the profound discovery that sometimes the way out of our own darkness is to light the path for someone else.